Grace, mercy, and peace be all unto you guys once again. You may be seated. As said before, my name is Austin Wellhausen. I'm the new vicar here, the new student pastor. It really is great to be here amongst you guys today. My wife Claire and I were really excited for what this year holds in store for us, and just really thankful that God has placed us among such a loving and joyful congregation. I've only been here for about 3 weeks, but over the course of the short 3 weeks, I've already seen and learned a lot of things. My first day, I got to witness Pastor Schultz make a few hospital visits, and I got to see firsthand the natural love and joy he has in caring for his people. I've gotten to see Pastor Becker sing and play his guitar for some of our kids attending summer camp here. I even got to see him do like this hippopotamus dance, which if you guys see him after the service, maybe ask him and he'll demonstrate that. I can't guarantee anything. I've also attended a lot of meetings here. I've gotten to see how a church is run and operates. I've gotten to talk about the vision and the mission for St. John's Church now and in the immediate future. It's been a short 3 weeks, but I've definitely seen and learned a lot. But if there's one thing I've learned, I think that stands out more than anything else, it's that, speaking bluntly, I'm not sure if I'm qualified to do this job. I don't really think I have the naturally joyful and loving attitude that Pastor Schultz has. I can't sing or play guitar as well as Pastor Becker. Guys, I'm only 24 years old. I've been in school my entire life. This is the first big kid job I've had, so to speak. My dad, he wasn't a pastor, so the idea of what a pastor does on a daily and weekly basis, I'm still learning. I don't know a whole lot about that. Don't get me wrong, it's really been an awesome 3 weeks here, and I can't stress that enough, very excited for this year to meet some more people and just to experience the love of this congregation. But being in this new environment, it's definitely exposed a lot of my insecurities, and I think maybe now more than ever, I'm more aware of my own weaknesses than I've ever been before. But you know what, like me, I know that you guys too have been uncomfortable in new situations. Like me, I know that you guys struggle with insecurities and weaknesses on a daily basis. But what I don't know about you guys is, where do you turn to in those times of weakness? Where do you go? I love turning to 2 Corinthians 12 when my fear of failure kicks in. I really love what Paul has to say to us about boasting in our weaknesses. This passage that we're going to talk about today, it's had an incredible influence on my own life, and I hope and pray that God would use it to have an incredible influence on your life today. If there's any verse we're going to zero in on in this passage, it's going to be 2 Corinthians 12:9, which says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest on me." I think what I find so compelling about this passage is Paul's use of the word boasting, right? And he uses it a few times, and I don't know if you guys have the text in your bulletin, but he uses it first in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 30, and I'm going to go ahead and read that. Paul says, "If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness." Okay, and he says it again in chapter 12, verse 9 that I just read. "Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest on me." Whenever Paul uses the word boasting, or the idea of like bragging, it's always associated with weakness. And I'm not sure if we really, when we think about boasting, do we always associate it with weakness like Paul does? Okay, so I want to talk about two things to start. The first thing I want to talk about is, what do we tend to boast in? What is natural? What do we naturally brag about? What do we naturally take pride in? All right, then I also want to talk about, what do we really think about our weaknesses? Okay, so first, what do we tend to boast about? The idea of boasting in our weaknesses, that's a pretty radical idea, I think, that Paul has, right? How many of you guys call up your insurance agencies and brag about how bad at drivers you are, right? We don't really see that happening. I don't know if you can ever recall a time that you truthfully and honestly boasted about your weaknesses. No, what do we tend to boast in? Obviously, we tend to boast in our strengths, right? We like to brag about our accomplishments. We long to be praised and to be glorified. And in a way, I think we long to be worshiped. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't think Paul's saying that, we shouldn't take pride in our gifts and abilities. We shouldn't use the gifts that God has given us to love and serve others. But I think what he is saying is there's a danger here if we're boasting too much in our strengths, if we're taking too much pride in our own accomplishments. Because the more we boast in ourselves, how much are we boasting about God? If you guys could think of a time when, maybe you did boast a little too much in yourselves. You took a little too much pride in your own accomplishments. Well, how much during that moment were you thinking about the gifts that God has given you? Probably not a whole lot, right? So obviously, naturally, our tendency is to boast in our strengths. Okay, so then what do we really think about our weaknesses? Well, long story short, we don't like them very much, do they? My wife and I were really big fans of the TV show The Office. We've been watching a lot of that on Netflix. And if you guys are familiar with the show, you know that the main character is a guy by the name of Michael Scott. He's the boss of this paper company. And if you've seen the show, you know that Michael Scott has probably about 1,000,001 weaknesses. Okay, this dude can't do anything right. And in one episode, Michael Scott is being asked about his weaknesses. And do you want to know what he says they are? Well, according to Michael Scott, his weaknesses are that he spends too much time volunteering and he sings in the shower. Okay, this is also the same episode that he's hit someone with his car. Okay, so yeah, it's a comedy. It's supposed to be funny. But I think there's a lot of truth in that, right? Like Michael Scott, we also downplay our weaknesses. We may not, talk about the really big insecurities that we have that deep down we know are tearing us apart. But we'll talk about a few things that really aren't a big deal, right? I think the underlying problem is that we long to be perfect, we desire to be strong and independent, and we hate the fact that we aren't. We know deep down that we will never be what we really want to be. I think this is a problem that goes back to the beginning of time. If we think about the Garden of Eden, what's going on there? Adam and Eve had one job: don't eat the fruit, but they ate the fruit. Okay, so God's talking to them. He's asking them about their failures and about their moment of weakness. Okay, so what did they do? Well, Eve blames the serpent, right? And Adam blames Eve, and he also blames God. So like Adam and Eve, we try to hide our weaknesses. We don't want to depend on God. We don't want God to be our strength. Paul's letter to us today is a very personal, powerful testimony for him. Just to give some background, it's tough to kind of get the full picture of what's going on in this passage. But if you read 2 Corinthians 11, the chapter leading up to chapter 12, Paul's talking about, he's combating these guys called super apostles, right? He mocks them. They're fake apostles. Basically, Paul went into Corinth. He planted this church. He made friendships. He loved these people. He trained them in the faith until they started their own church. And then Paul did what Paul does. He left them to go start more churches. After he left, these fake apostles came in there and took the Corinthians away from the true teachings of Christianity. Okay, they stole, these apostles stole the Corinthians away from Paul. And to put yourself in Paul's shoes, I mean, this must have been pretty devastating, right? These are people that you've loved, you've spent time with, you trained, and they just went up and left him. You might ask why. Well, Paul makes some hints about that in chapter 11. According to Paul, these super apostles, as he jokingly calls them, they were probably better preachers than he was. So they were better public speakers. The Corinthians liked that, as opposed to Paul. These guys were very charismatic. They were wealthy and rich, and they probably looked the part. So on the surface, the Corinthians liked that these super apostles appeared stronger than Paul. And what's amazing is what Paul says in response to that. I mean, if Paul really wanted to, I think he could have bragged about his strengths. I mean, this is Paul. This is the guy that wrote half the New Testament. This guy's planted churches all over. This guy probably knows the Bible better than these guys. But he doesn't boast in any of that. No, instead, he chooses to boast about his weaknesses. Because by boasting in his weaknesses, he's boasting about Jesus. Instead of pointing the finger at himself, Paul points the finger at Jesus. Paul boasts about the guy that was beaten for him, that bled for him, and that died for him. But the best part is, not even death was strong enough for Jesus. And 3 days later, he walked out of that grave with open arms. As you guys will come to find over the course of this year, I'm just a diehard sports fan. My father graduated from Western Michigan University, so he likes to keep up with the Western Michigan Bronco football team. You guys probably didn't even know that was a team, and that's fine. But last season, the Western Michigan football coach would consistently tell his players, failure is growth. Okay? Failure is growth. He didn't tell his players not to fail. He just wanted them to learn from their failures. I really like that phrase, failure is growth. But I think we can do it one better. I think we can say that failure is Christ. Our failures and our weaknesses remind us of the strength we have in Jesus Christ. I want to finish this passage focusing again on 2 Corinthians 12:9. I use the ESV. I don't know what translations you guys have out there, but a lot of translations will translate the verse like this. He said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Okay, well, in the original Greek, that word for made perfect is a word called teleo. And what teleo literally means is to be completed or to be finished. So I think it might be better to translate the verse like this. Jesus says to Paul and to all of us today, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is completed in your weakness." It's finished. It's over. In our weaknesses, God's work is finished. It's finished because we know that it's not about me. It's not about you guys. It's not about any of us. It's all about Jesus. Amen.